Okay, so let's talk about what the experts agree and disagree about involving internet gaming disorder, otherwise known as pathological gambling. There's a million other terms for it too, but we're going to stick with those right now. All right, so let's look at slide number 3. What do the experts agree on? And this is coming from a review summary paper that was very recently published a year ago by Ferguson and Caldwell in 2019. Here are the areas of relative agreement. You never get 100% agreement, but relative agreement, most clinicians and researchers who are studying and working with internet gaming disorder, this is what they tend to agree on. 1, there are people who, overdo gaming. And of course, what do we mean by overdue? That in itself is a debatable question. But experts agree that there is some amount that is getting to the point where it could be interfering with a person's life in some way. Number 2, they agree that pathological forms of gaming are relatively rare, between 1 and 4%, depending on whose research you take a look at or whose clinical base you take a look at. The counterpoint for that is just because it's rare doesn't mean it's not necessarily clinically relevant. Look at something like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. They are relatively rare, but nonetheless, they are real psychological problems that create real problems in a person's life and do have a clinical relevance and benefit from intervention and treatment. So just the fact that whatever folks say is pathological gaming is relatively rare, that doesn't mean we shouldn't care about it. Number 3, pathological gaming is typically comorbid with existing disorders. Okay, so especially major depression, anxiety disorders like generalized anxiety, panic disorder, social phobias, things of social anxiety disorder. It is also comorbid with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, and also disorders on the autism spectrum, so autism, Asperger's, and related disorders. And finally, number 4, experts agree that the idea of pathological gaming is worthy of further study. So not let's shelve it because there's nothing clinically relevant here. Let's not make it a disorder in the DSM-5 yet because we don't know that there's enough reason to do that. Let's continue to study it. And especially let's continue to study it with transparency and open access, meaning there are all kinds of open access journals and websites where anyone can easily access the findings of research rather than, say, paying for them to access them from a journal. And the idea is, look, let's make as much data as possible, easily accessible and available so we can get a sense of whether this is something that should in fact be clinically relevant and qualify at some point as a disorder. So those are the areas of agreement. Let's mosey on down to slide number 4. What are the areas of disagreement? Where do we find researchers and clinicians are not on the same page? Not even close. All right, number 1 area of disagreement. Can pathological gaming really be compared with substance abuse, which you guys know, is a disorder in the DSM-5? One treatment center went so far as to say pathological gaming is going to be the next opioid epidemic. Kind of fun to say that. Say it with me. That might be taking it a bit far. The opioid epidemic in the United States and in other countries in Europe has long been known for some time to be a very serious and deadly problem. To try to align some amount of gaming with an epidemic that kills people in large numbers, that seems a bit far-fetched. And what the folks who say it should be treated like an epidemic, such as the opioid epidemic say, they say, look, we have research to suggest that the same dopaminergic systems in the brain are activated by large amounts of gaming, just like substances. We have evidence to suggest that people who are indulging in the internet too much, too frequently, for too long, experience tolerance and withdrawal, just like people who have drug addiction, alcohol addiction do. Well, as you guys know a little bit from the last class, the data on the biology of gaming that attempts to align it with alcohol and drug use is a little bit sketchy for the reasons I talked at length about in the last class, so I'm not going to regurgitate it here. Number 2, the experts do not agree on whether or not pathological gaming, if it is indicative of something clinically relevant and a disorder state, they do not agree as to whether or not it should be its own unique standalone disorder, rather than treated instead as one of many symptoms of other underlying existing disorders in the DSM. That's one thing. Another thing they don't agree on is whether or not there is any meaningful way to distinguish between clinical and non-clinical samples, meaning what's the distinguishing factor between people we want to say have a pathological gaming problem and people who have a non-pathological gaming involvement? Because what some studies are showing, for example, as I mentioned in Tuesday's class, length of time alone is not a good distinguishing factor. There are people, as I said in Tuesday's class, who spend large amounts of time on the internet and they are not showing any of the symptomology that was proposed by the task force for the inclusion of internet gaming disorder. So what are the meaningful criteria, if any, for that matter, to distinguish clinically relevant pathological gaming and non-clinically relevant gaming? Don't know. Another thing that experts disagree on at this time is whether or not people use this gaming behavior as a coping mechanism for something else. So again, rather than treat it as a standalone disorder, is it a coping mechanism for depression? Is it a coping mechanism for anxiety? Is it a coping mechanism for social anxiety disorder, et cetera, et cetera? And so the fact that this is often comorbid with those other disorders, as I mentioned on the previous slide and in the previous class, is suggestive that, maybe this is just a coping mechanism and it's not a disorder in its own right. And folks disagree on whether or not, given the current inability to distinguish between people, reliably distinguish between people who have a pathological gaming form and people who don't and just game and high numbers or high quantity, but they don't have pathology associated with it. The fear is, since we cannot reliably distinguish between those two groups, we might have what we call too many false positives. And what a false positive means, and I think I mentioned this in prior class, but just in case, false positive means we are calling people problematic, dysfunctional, unhealthy, who really aren't. So there's a fear that since we don't really have criteria to distinguish between people who game in high levels that are pathological and people who game in high levels that are not showing any of the pathology, we might just overdiagnose this. And we're going to call healthy gamers who are just passionate about gaming people who have internet gaming disorder. Just like some people are passionate about, like I mentioned last class, hobbies, right? Some people are passionate about gardening. Some people are passionate about dancing. I mean, are we going to get to the point where we're going to count the number of hours per week you spend gardening as something that could mean you have gardening disorder? Dancing disorder? Come on. Seems a little crazy. All right. Number 3, areas of disagreement that Ferguson and Caldwell report in their recent review. The question is, are games even worth singling out for a mental health disorder? Like, why is that hobby in particular being singled out? Besides pathological gambling, which is a disorder in the DSM-5, why gaming? Why are we not calling a bunch of other hobbies potentially pathological too then, right? Like I said, dancing, gardening, whatever. Also, the question has been raised by experts, is it clinically useful or even likely to resolve on its own? I mean, what if we decide there is a level of gaming that can become problematic? might detract from somebody's schoolwork, might detract from somebody's work, might detract from their relationships. Is this something that really requires medical intervention or psychiatric intervention? Or is it something that's likely to resolve on its own, where someone is likely to realize, oh, geez, I'm spending way too much time playing games online, and I'm not doing this and I'm not doing that. I better ease up. Do we really need the psychiatric and medical profession to get involved? And finally, area of disagreement number 4. Could pathological gaming diagnoses have unintended negative consequences? In other words, let's say we decide as a field that this should be a disorder. In the DSM-6, the next one, this should be a disorder. Are there some unintended negative consequences of doing that? The idea is if we do that, we can help people who have pathological gaming. But are there some negative consequences that are not being considered? One is those false positives, again, that I mentioned. Saying people who use the internet or game at a high amount or high level are automatically pathological when it's not actually harming them or their lives in any way. Are we going to start treating that instead of another disorder that this is really a symptom of, and then we're missing the larger disorder because we're focusing too narrowly on the gaming, right? And a very, 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 I like to say the word very, right? Very, 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 very unintended consequence might be increased government intrusive policies and exploitative treatment centers. Now, soon, I'm going to talk to you about the policies being referred to here that some countries have adopted. And some folks feel those policies are intruding on their personal freedom unnecessarily. Exploitative treatment centers, meaning centers that have opened, and I'm going to show you some examples in class today, treatment centers that cost a shit ton of money, that are explicitly focused on treating internet addiction, pathological gaming. Is this just a way to exploit something that doesn't need expensive treatment to make profit? Good way to end this video. I'll see you on the next one.